They said I shouldn't come to the wedding because I'd embarrass them. My granddaughter said it first, but I heard the echo in her mother's voice, the soft approval that followed. "It's not personal, Mom," my daughter said. "It's just, her friends are all young and you might feel out of place." I remember that sentence more vividly than the birth of any of my grandchildren. It was like being told you'd expired quietly on the shelf and everyone was too polite to throw you out. I didn't argue. I never was the kind of woman who fought over invitations. I simply nodded, said I understood, and hung up the phone. Then I sat in my chair for a long time, staring at the wall, realizing that I had been cut out of something that once felt like the center of my world. They said I'd embarrass them, me, the one who raised their parents, the one who once walked through storms so they could have sunshine. I thought about that a long time. I was 71 then, still walking to the market twice a week, still cooking from scratch, still painting my nails every Sunday like my late husband used to like. I wasn't glamorous, but I was clean, decent, composed. I wore a navy dress that had seen weddings, funerals, and baptisms alike, and I always carried a handkerchief in my purse. That's what my generation did. We prepared for tears, even when no one else expected them. When my granddaughter told me not to come, I didn't cry. I folded the invitation card back into its envelope and placed it in the top drawer of my dresser beside the small tin of buttons I'd collected from her childhood dresses. I thought maybe she'd change her mind. Maybe there would be a call, a message, a small apology. I even kept my travel bag half-packed for a week. Foolish, perhaps, but hope at my age doesn't die. It just quiets down until someone mentions your name. When the wedding day came, I baked a cake anyway, a lemon one, the kind she used to love when she was little and spent summers with me. I wrapped it in foil, tied a yellow ribbon around it, and left it on the counter. Then I sat in my chair by the window and watched the sunlight crawl across the floorboards until evening. Around 6, the neighbors' lights came on, and I imagined the photographs being taken somewhere far away, her in white, her mother beside her, smiling with that tight, practiced pride. I didn't picture myself there. I simply tried to imagine what it would have felt like not to be the reason for someone else's discomfort. That was the part that hurt the most. Not that they didn't want me, but that my presence was something to manage, to minimize, to erase gently with polite words. I had become a stain on their version of perfection. The next morning, I swept the floor and put away the cake. I gave half to the mail carrier who had always asked about my roses, and the rest to the birds. I remember how they came. 2 sparrows first, then a pair of doves. They pecked at the crumbs, like little guests who weren't ashamed to be seen with me. I thought, this is my celebration then, a quiet feast of wings and sunlight. I was embarrassed even for myself, but in a strange way, it felt liberating. There was nothing left to prove. The family had completed its circle without me in it, and I was now a line drawn outside the pattern. People think rejection kills quickly, but it doesn't. It lingers like humidity. It settles into your skin. In the weeks after the wedding, I found myself rehearsing conversations that would never happen. How I would tell her about her great-grandfather's hands, about how he once built our first table from scrap wood because we couldn't afford furniture, how I wanted to give her that table one day. But the stories began to lose their audience long before she said those words. She had been slipping away for years, first through the screen of her phone, then through polite texts, then through silence. The wedding was only the final declaration of independence, from me, from history, from the reminder that time is merciless and the body fails. Still, I wasn't bitter, at least not at first. I told my neighbor that youth had its own blindness, that perhaps one day she'd understand. I told myself the same thing too. But when I went to the grocery store and someone asked if I was traveling soon, I couldn't answer. My face burned. I smiled and said, "No, not this time." I came home, placed my purse on the table, and realized that every excuse I made for them was another small betrayal of myself. You can forgive a child for ignorance, but how do you forgive a grown woman for shame? That summer, I stopped attending church socials. I couldn't bear the questions. How was the wedding? Did you cry? And I didn't have the heart to lie convincingly. Instead, I started taking long walks by the shore in the early mornings, when no one was around to ask or to pity. The sea became my confessional. I'd whisper my disappointments to the waves, and they would answer with indifference. There's a strange comfort in being insignificant to something vast. You stop begging for space and small hearts. You start breathing again. I remember thinking, maybe this is what freedom looks like at 71, lonely but clean. And yet, on quiet nights, I still reached for that old wedding invitation. The paper had softened at the corners. The gold lettering had faded slightly, but it still read her name, Evelyn Grace Harper, bride. Such a beautiful name. I traced the letters with my thumb, and I could almost hear her at 5 years old, laughing as she tried to write her name for the first time on my kitchen table, her tongue between her teeth, her little fingers sticky with jam. "Grandma, did I spell it right?" she'd asked. "Almost," I'd said. "You just forgot the heart above the I." She'd drawn it then, a small lopsided heart. I've never forgotten that. Maybe that's what family really is, one long forgetting of where you left the heart. Years passed quickly after that, as they do when no one's waiting for you. Birthdays came and went. I received fewer cards, fewer calls. My daughter sent holiday photos now and then. Evelyn in Paris, Evelyn with a baby of her own. Evelyn smiling in kitchens that looked nothing like mine. I kept them in a drawer I never opened. Sometimes I'd dust the frame of my late husband's picture and tell him, "They're doing fine." He never answered, of course, but I like to think he approved of my restraint. Then one day, 15 years later, the silence broke. But that's another chapter. The story, my story, begins here, with the sound of that first rejection still humming in my chest, with the echo of a young woman's shame that turned into an old woman's exile. I've learned that cruelty spoken softly can wound deeper than shouting, and that love, when dressed as pity, is just another form of abandonment. So yes, my granddaughter once told me not to come to her wedding because I would embarrass her. But what she didn't know was that she wasn't just closing a door, she was setting a mirror between us. And every year since, I've had to look into it and ask myself which one of us truly disappeared. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the catalyst arrived, though I didn't know it at the time. A white envelope slid through my mail slot and landed on the floor with a small, unimportant sound, like something too light to matter. Inside was a photograph, my granddaughter in her wedding dress, standing beneath an arch of pale roses, her hand resting gently on her husband's arm, her face tilted toward the camera in a way that made her look like someone I didn't know. The card beneath it read simply, "Mr. and Mrs. Daniel Harper extend their gratitude for your kind wishes." No signature, no mention of love. Just a pre-printed message from a printer that didn't know it was delivering a quiet funeral notice, not for a person, but for a bond that had once seemed unbreakable. I stood at my kitchen counter for a long time, the photo trembling slightly in my hands. I didn't cry, not immediately. Tears require a certain freshness of wound, and mine had already begun to scab over from months of polite exclusion. But when I placed the card against the refrigerator door with a small magnet shaped like a bird, I felt something in me settle into stillness. It was the stillness of a woman realizing she'd been officially replaced in her own lineage. That evening, I made tea and sat by the window, the street lamp outside flickering in its usual uneven rhythm. I thought about calling my daughter just to hear her voice, just to ask some meaningless question about the weather or her garden, anything that would remind me I was still a part of the living conversation. But I didn't. I'd learned by then that my voice had become something they tolerated, not something they sought. I used to speak often, to fill silences before they grew awkward, to tell stories that I thought would comfort or amuse. Now I understood that my words were heavy stones dropped into water. They disturbed the surface, then sank without trace. I sipped my tea and told myself that the photograph was enough, proof that she was alive, that she was beautiful, that she no longer needed me. That's what every mother and grandmother tells herself when the family drifts away. They're fine without me. But there is no comfort in being obsolete. A few days later, a small parcel arrived. No return address, just my own name written in my daughter's handwriting, careful and perfunctory. Inside was a square of wedding cake wrapped in wax paper, already hard along the edges. There was a note tucked beside it. Mom, Evelyn thought it would be nice if you had a piece of the cake. Hope you're well. Love, Claire. The word love was smaller than the rest, as though embarrassed to be there. I stared at that slice of cake for a long time, then unwrapped it, cut a small corner, and placed it on a plate. It tasted of sugar and almond extract and something faintly artificial, a flavor too polished to be real. I ate one bite, then pushed it away. I wanted to throw it out, but I couldn't. I left it on the counter for days, watching it dry and crack and finally crumble. I told myself it was just cake, but deep down I knew it wasn't. It was evidence, the kind of evidence that only the invisible collect. After that, the calls stopped altogether. The silence stretched across seasons. I kept myself busy, cleaning, knitting scarves for the donation bin, tending to the same roses that had once made my granddaughter laugh because she said they smelled like old ladies and secrets. I began to talk to them again, not like a mad woman, but like someone in need of an audience that wouldn't interrupt. I told them about the weather, about the news, about how the new pharmacist had mistaken me for someone else. The roses never corrected me, and there was a mercy in that. One morning, I saw an article online, one of those local lifestyle pieces that pretend to be human stories. A young couple's fairy tale wedding. Modern elegance meets timeless love. There she was, my Evelyn, smiling in that same pale gown, framed by chandeliers and laughter. The caption listed the guests, including family and close friends. I read through every name, and none of them were mine, not one. The article ended with a quote from her. I'm so grateful for everyone who helped make this day unforgettable. I closed the tab and sat back in my chair. The house felt heavier after that. You can tell yourself that blood is thicker than water, but no one warns you how easily it can be diluted by pride. That night, I dreamed I was at the wedding after all. In the dream, I sat at a small table at the very back beside the catering staff. No one noticed me. The band played, the champagne flowed, and when the photographer called for family only, I stood up instinctively, only to realize that the word no longer included me. I woke before dawn, heart pounding, sheets damp with the kind of sweat that only comes from humiliation revisited. I made coffee and watched the sun climb slowly over the houses across the street, painting the sky a soft, indifferent pink. I thought of all the times I had forgiven people before they even asked, and wondered if perhaps forgiveness was just another form of self-erasure. A week later, the real breaking point came. My daughter called. Her voice was brisk, full of the efficiency that successful people use when addressing small inconveniences. "Mom," she said, "I just wanted to check that you got the package." I told her I had. "Good," she said. "Evelyn was worried it might have gotten lost. She feels bad you couldn't come, but you understand, right? It was such a busy day." The word busy struck me like a slap. I had been erased not by anger or cruelty, but by logistics. I murmured something polite. She kept talking, her words flowing over me like cold water. "We'll visit soon, maybe around Christmas. The kids are so busy. She's thinking of starting her own business. You'd be so proud." I listened until the sound of her voice began to blur. I realized she wasn't calling to speak to me, but to silence her own guilt. When the call ended, I sat in the kitchen staring at the receiver, my tea gone cold, my reflection faint in the window glass. That was the moment I knew something had truly shifted. Love, once taken for granted, had become an optional extra, a luxury item that the young could afford to neglect. That night, I went through old albums. I looked at pictures of Evelyn as a baby, her toothless grin, the way she'd clutch my finger with absolute trust. I could almost feel her small hand again, warm and certain. Somewhere between those photographs and the glossy wedding image on my fridge, the thread had snapped. I didn't know when exactly it happened, only that it had, and that it wasn't coming back. I found one photo of her at 8, sitting on my lap, flour on her cheeks from baking. On the back, I had written, "Someday she'll bake for me." I turned it over and laughed quietly, not bitterly, but with the strange amusement of someone who's seen too much irony to fear it anymore. Then I placed it back in the album, closed the cover, and said aloud, "That's enough then." The next morning, I walked to the post office and sent a small package of my own, the gift I had bought for her wedding, a lace tablecloth I'd embroidered. Over the course of a year, I included a brief note. "For your new home, may it hold warmth." I knew it wouldn't be displayed. It would end up in a drawer, or maybe a charity box, but sending it felt like sealing a chapter. On the walk back, the air smelled of rain and car exhaust, the sky low and gray. I passed a group of girls laughing, their arms linked, their youth spilling into the street like sunlight. One of them wore a dress the same shade as mine from years ago. For a moment, I felt something between envy and nostalgia, but it passed. Life moves one way only. We either keep up or get left behind. When I reached home, I took the wedding photograph off the fridge. I looked at it one last time and then slipped it into a drawer. The magnet, the small blue bird, I left in place. It looked strange hovering over nothing, but somehow appropriate. That was the day I stopped waiting for their calls, their visits, their explanations. I told myself I was fine, that I didn't need them, but the truth was quieter, heavier. The truth was that I'd begun to accept invisibility as a form of safety. Because the alternative, to admit the depth of that loneliness, was more terrifying than the silence itself. That moment, though I couldn't name it then, was the true beginning of everything that came after. The catalyst wasn't the cruelty. It was the realization that I had mistaken endurance for love. The years that followed were not dramatic, not even remarkable from the outside. They passed like fog, slowly, soundlessly, and with a kind of steady blindness that can almost look like peace if you squint. I began to shrink my life without noticing. First, it was the phone calls I stopped making. Then the holidays I stopped expecting invitations for. Then the mirror I stopped looking into, except to brush my hair. My world became small, contained to the rooms I could clean in a single afternoon. There was a relief in that, or maybe it was resignation. I told myself I preferred solitude. I even convinced myself that quiet was a kind of dignity. But the truth was simpler. I had nowhere else to go, and no one left to listen. I had become the kind of woman whose absence caused no ripples. That realization arrived slowly, almost kindly, until one day it was simply a fact, like the stiffness in my knees or the way my hands trembled when I poured tea. I began keeping a notebook on the kitchen table. At first it was just for groceries and reminders, milk, bread, medication. But then small sentences began to appear between the lists, unplanned, almost by accident. The birds are late this year. Dreamed of Evelyn again. Do people remember the sound of your voice after you stop calling? It wasn't poetry or confession, just a record of presence, proof that I still had thoughts, that something moved inside me even when the world stayed still. Some days I wrote down snippets of conversations overheard in the store, or the color of a stranger's scarf, or the way the cashier smiled without meeting my eyes. These details became my companions. I suppose that's what happens when your life gets quiet enough. Even crumbs of human contact start to feel like a feast. Money was not the problem. I had my pension, the savings Derek left behind, and the old house that had been paid off decades earlier. The problem was time. There was too much of it, wide and empty like a room you can't fill, no matter how much furniture you move around. I took up knitting again, something to keep my hands busy. I made scarves, blankets, mittens, all of which ended up in a box labeled for later. Later never came. I baked sometimes too, even though no one was there to eat it. The smell of bread filled the kitchen, and for a few hours I could pretend I was still needed. When the loaves cooled, I'd wrap them in cloth and leave them at the neighbor's door, unsigned. They always disappeared by morning. That was enough conversation for me. My daughter called once every few months. The conversations were shallow, like talking through glass. She'd ask about my health, then rush to tell me how busy she was. Work, the grandchildren, travel. The word "we" always included everyone except me. Sometimes I'd start to mention something from the past, the time she broke her arm skating, or the way she used to sing in the back seat. But she'd change the subject so quickly, it was almost graceful. I stopped offering memories after that. They were unwanted currency in a new economy of efficiency and success. I could tell she thought of me as someone frozen in a photograph, old but tidy, safely unchanging. I wanted to tell her that stillness is not peace, that silence is not forgiveness, but I didn't. I'd learned that the older you get, the more your words are measured by how inconvenient they are to others. My world shrank further. I sold my car. The insurance was too much, and I didn't drive far anymore. The bus stop was only a block away, though I rarely used it. I found comfort in routines, watering the plants every morning, walking to the corner store on Thursdays, washing the kitchen floor on Sundays. Each repetition was a small anchor, a way of convincing myself I was still living deliberately, not merely surviving out of habit. I told myself I was content. Sometimes I even believed it, but every so often, late at night, I'd wake to the sound of the wind pressing against the windows and feel the weight of my own invisibility. It's strange how loneliness has a sound, not the absence of noise, but a kind of low hum that settles behind the ribs and stays there. One morning, the hum grew too loud. I woke before dawn, restless, and sat in the dark for a long time. The house smelled faintly of dust and lavender oil. I thought about the years ahead, endless copies of this same day, and something inside me rebelled, quietly but decisively. I stood up, pulled on my coat, and went for a walk without brushing my hair or checking the weather. The streets were empty except for the early paper boy and a stray cat that followed me for half a block. When I reached the park, I stopped at a bench near the pond. The water was still, reflecting the first gray light of morning. I sat there until the cold began to seep through my coat. I don't know how long I stayed, maybe an hour, maybe 3. All I remember is thinking that life had become like that pond, motionless, waiting for something to disturb it. A week later, I saw a small notice on the community board at the grocery store. Senior Center volunteers needed. It wasn't much, but it was a shape in the fog. I tore off one of the tabs with a phone number and slipped it into my pocket. For 3 days, I carried it around, touching it like a secret. Finally, on Friday, I called. A cheerful voice answered, too cheerful, the kind of voice that uses people's first names without asking permission. She told me they could always use help, reading to residents, sorting donations, serving lunches. It'll be fun, she said. I didn't want fun. I wanted a reason to leave the house. I went the next day. The center was a faded building with cheerful posters taped to the walls and the smell of disinfectant clinging to the air. They gave me an apron and assigned me to the lunchroom. My job was to serve soup and wipe tables. I was surrounded by people my age and older, but I felt like a stranger among them. They talked about grandchildren, medications, television shows I'd never seen. Yet, amid the noise, I felt a pulse of something I hadn't known I missed. Proximity, the background hum of other lives brushing against mine. After the first week, I began to look forward to Saturdays. I didn't make friends, not exactly, but there was one woman named Hilda who always asked me to sit with her for tea after the shift. She'd lost her husband too, and her children lived in another state. We didn't talk much. We just sat and shared the silence like a blanket. Then, one afternoon, as we were cleaning up, Hilda said something that stayed with me. "You know what the worst part is?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron. "They forget you're still changing. They think you're done." I nodded because I knew. That night, I couldn't sleep. Her words echoed in my head. They think you're done. That was exactly it. I wasn't angry at Evelyn for the wedding anymore. Not really. I was angry at the idea that I'd stopped existing as a person with texture and edges and possibility. To them, I was fixed, finished, archived. But inside, I could still feel movement, like a tide that refused to go out completely. A few weeks later, on a rainy afternoon, I decided to clean the attic. It had been years since I'd gone up there. The air was thick with dust and the faint smell of old fabric. I opened boxes I hadn't touched in decades. Derek's letters from when we were courting, my daughter's school reports, yellowed receipts from furniture we no longer owned. In one corner, I found a small suitcase I didn't recognize. When I opened it, I discovered a stack of drawings Evelyn had made as a child. Crooked hearts, stick figures, a card that read, "To Grandma, best friend forever." The paper was brittle, the colors faded, but the handwriting was unmistakable. I sat on the floor and cried for the first time in years, not because of sadness alone, but because the memory of love was still alive somewhere, trapped in the lines of crayon. When the tears stopped, I folded the drawings back carefully and placed them in my lap. I realized then that I was tired of being the ghost of someone else's past. That night, I did something impulsive. I packed a small bag, a few clothes, my notebook, the envelope of drawings, and took out the small savings account booklet Derek had left me. There was enough to travel, to start over somewhere quieter, somewhere no one knew who I had been. I didn't know yet where I'd go. I just knew I had to go, not to run away, but to step out of the invisible circle I'd been sitting in for too long. When dawn came, I stood by the window watching the first light hit the rooftops. It was the same view I'd seen for 15 years. But for the first time, it didn't feel like a prison. It felt like a threshold. I didn't leave that day. Not yet. But something inside me already had. The decision itself was the beginning, a pulse of life where stillness had ruled. I went to bed knowing that tomorrow would look exactly the same, yet I would be different in it. And that difference, that private rebellion against disappearing, was enough to make the air taste lighter. I suppose that's how change begins at my age, not with noise or declarations, but with a quiet refusal to keep living like a ghost. The shift came quietly, almost imperceptibly, as most changes do when you've been silent for too long. It began with a sound, the low groan of the wind outside my window one March morning, and the sudden thought that I no longer wanted to die in that house. There was nothing dramatic about the decision. No letter, no final argument, no burning of bridges. I simply realized I had stayed still long enough for the walls to memorize me, and that frightened me more than loneliness ever had. I wanted to be somewhere my absence wouldn't echo. I wanted to live where I wasn't already a ghost. That morning, I called the real estate agent, whose flyer had been sitting on my counter for months. She sounded surprised to hear from me, as if old women like me were meant to keep waiting for something rather than act. I told her I wanted to sell the house quickly. No sentimental fuss, no open house tours. She promised to send paperwork by the end of the week. When I hung up, I felt both terrified and absurdly light. It took less than a month. The papers arrived, the valuation came, and I signed them with a hand that trembled only slightly. My daughter didn't know. There was no reason to tell her. The house had long ceased to be a shared memory. It was just a property she'd inherited in her imagination, not one she'd earned in her affection. I packed slowly, sorting through decades of living. Some things went to charity, Derek's suits, the extra dishes, the thick curtains that kept out more light than they ever let in. I kept small things, the notebook, the crayon drawings, one of Derek's watches that no longer worked, and a handful of photographs I could look at without bitterness. I left behind the rest. On the morning the moving van came, I stood in the doorway with my coat already on and looked around one last time. The rooms were stripped bare, and for the first time, they looked honest. Every space that had once carried a conversation or a fight or a lullaby was now just air and dust. I whispered a quiet thank you, not to the house, but to the woman who had survived in it, and closed the door. I didn't go far. I took a train north to a small coastal town where no one knew my name. The trip itself felt surreal. The landscape sliding past in slow motion, fields giving way to forests, forests to stretches of mist and water. I carried only one suitcase and my handbag. I remember sitting by the window as the train moved through the rain, thinking about how the world outside looked like a painting that had been left out in the weather, colors blurred but still beautiful. When we arrived, I rented a small room above a bakery. The air smelled of yeast and salt, and the landlady was a brisk woman with hair the color of smoke. She didn't ask questions, which was a mercy. She handed me a key, pointed to the stairs, and said rent was due on Mondays. The simplicity of it felt like grace. At first, the days slipped by without structure. I walked a lot, exploring streets that twisted down toward the harbor, small shops with fading signs, gardens sprouting between cracked fences. No one paid attention to me, and that anonymity felt luxurious. I could sit at a cafe for hours, sipping weak coffee and pretending to read the newspaper while watching the tide roll in and out. For the first time in years, I didn't feel watched or measured. It's strange how liberation can feel so similar to invisibility. The difference lies only in whether you choose it or not. One morning, while sorting through my suitcase, I found the old photograph of Evelyn as a child, the one with the flower on her cheeks. I had looked at it 1,000 times before, always with a kind of ache, but that morning something was different. I saw not just the child who had loved me, but the woman she had become, and I realized that I didn't have to hate one to mourn the other. I placed the photograph on the small table by my bed and made myself a promise. I would stop carrying the story like an open wound. I would begin to live as if love, even when lost, could still leave warmth behind. That was the first quiet act of forgiveness. Not for her, not yet, but for myself. It was around that time I started volunteering at the local library. They needed help cataloging donations, and I had always liked the smell of old paper, the weight of books that had passed through many hands. The librarian, a man named Samuel with a shy smile, was patient with my slowness on the computer. We rarely talked beyond the work, but his gentleness reminded me that kindness didn't always have to come wrapped in family. After the first week, he brought me a cup of tea during a long afternoon and said, "You seem like someone who listens carefully." It was such a simple statement, but it felt like someone had touched a place in me I'd forgotten existed. Listening, that was all I had done for most of my life, though no one ever noticed. Evenings were my favorite. The town quieted early, and I'd sit by my window watching the last light fade over the water. The sea had a rhythm that seemed to sync with my breathing. I began writing again, not notes this time, but small paragraphs, reflections, memories, fragments of thought. Some of them were about Derek, some about Evelyn, others about nothing at all. I wasn't trying to build anything coherent. It was enough to see words form beneath my hand, proof that my mind hadn't gone still. One night, as I wrote, I caught sight of my reflection in the glass. For a moment, I didn't recognize the woman staring back. She looked older, yes, but also steadier, her gaze level, her mouth softened by something that might have been acceptance. I realized then that I had stopped waiting to be found. Spring came late that year. The cherry trees bloomed unevenly, petals scattered by sudden gusts of wind that carried the scent of salt and damp earth. I spent mornings walking by the pier, watching fishermen mend their nets. One of them, a gray-bearded man named Julian, would always greet me with a nod and a "Still breathing, are we?" The first time, I laughed, surprised at the sound of it. It had been years since laughter felt natural in my throat. We never exchanged more than a few sentences, but those brief conversations began to stitch something back together in me, the way simple, steady things do after a long season of chaos. Sometimes, when I passed the bakery downstairs, the young woman at the counter would offer me the day-old rolls for half price. She didn't know my name either, but she always smiled. Once I asked if I could pay full price anyway. "You don't have to," she said, but I did. There's a dignity in paying your own way, no matter how small the transaction. It reminded me of all the years I'd poured myself into others, into meals, into comfort, into making life easy for people who had forgotten I existed. Now I could give without disappearing. One evening, I attended a small concert at the town hall. A string quartet played old melodies, the kind that linger long after the notes fade. As they played, I felt a sudden, sharp memory. Evelyn sitting cross-legged on the floor of my living room, humming tunelessly as I folded laundry. I remembered how she used to stop mid-song to ask, "Do you think people stop loving when they forget to say it?" And how I'd answered, "No, darling. Love just goes quiet for a while." I don't know why that line came back to me, but it did, and I realized that maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe love doesn't go quiet. It just changes language, finds new forms of survival. After the concert, I walked home under a thin drizzle, the streets shining with reflected lamplight. The sound of my shoes against the wet pavement was rhythmic, almost musical. I felt old, yes, but not finished. I thought about my daughter and Evelyn, about all the versions of them I had carried in my heart, the bright, the cruel, the absent. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to label them as villains in my story. They had their own blindnesses, their own wounds shaped by a world that teaches people to hide anything imperfect. Perhaps my love had embarrassed them because it was too unguarded, too real. I couldn't change that, but I could stop trying to explain myself to people who didn't want to understand. By the time I reached my room, the rain had stopped. I took off my coat, hung it by the window, and sat down at my desk. I wrote one sentence. I am still here, and that is not nothing. It wasn't profound or elegant, but it was true. And truth, I was learning, was its own kind of prayer. That was the midpoint, though I didn't name it then. The quiet shift from existing as someone left behind to living as someone walking forward, even if the steps were small and slow. The sea outside kept its rhythm, unbothered by my revelations, but I could feel something within me aligning with it. I wasn't healed, not yet, but I was awake again, and that was enough to begin. The day she returned was gray and wet, the kind of day when the sky looks heavy enough to fall. I had just come back from the market, a loaf of bread under my arm, and the sound of seagulls scraping across the air. I remember feeling calm that morning, the sort of calm that comes after long practice, when your solitude has become so disciplined it no longer aches. I unlocked my door, shook the rain from my coat, and went to put the kettle on. The knock came just as the water began to hum, soft at first, then again, a little harder, as if whoever stood outside didn't quite believe I'd answer. I thought it was the landlady at first, or perhaps the postman needing a signature. I opened the door without thinking, and there she was, older, thinner, her face drawn tight with fatigue and something else, something rawer, like fear that hadn't yet found words. My granddaughter, my Evelyn. 15 years had turned her into a stranger, yet her eyes were the same, large, gray, and searching, the eyes of a child who once thought the world could not wound her because I stood in front of it. She said my name the way a person might test if a bridge still holds. Grandma. The word was quiet, uncertain, like she wasn't sure she had the right to use it anymore. For a long moment, I said nothing. My hands were still damp from the rain, and I could feel the tremor in my fingers as I gripped the edge of the door. Behind her was the dull gleam of a car parked haphazardly by the curb, its back seat piled with clothes and boxes. Her hair was tangled, her coat too thin for the weather. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice breaking slightly on the second word. And though I could have hesitated, though I could have reminded her of every silence, every absence, every wound she had chosen not to see, I simply stepped aside. "You'd better," I said. "You'll catch your death out there." Inside, the warmth startled her. She stood just past the threshold, dripping water onto the rug, her gaze moving around the small room as if trying to understand where her own history fit into it. I motioned for her to sit. She didn't. She kept her hands wrapped around the strap of her bag, clutching it like a lifeline. I poured tea without asking what she wanted, because that was the sort of question people like her no longer knew how to answer. When I placed the cup in front of her, she whispered thank you, barely audible. The steam rose between us like a veil. We sat there for a while, the silence stretching like an old thread between two sides of a tear. Finally, she spoke. I didn't know where else to go. The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of everything unspoken. I wanted to ask where her husband was, what had happened to her bright photographs, her perfect life, her elegant captions about gratitude and blessings. But I didn't. Instead, I said, "Well, you're here now." She nodded, eyes lowered. When she reached for the cup, her hands shook. I noticed the dirt under her nails, the faint bruise on her wrist, the way she flinched each time thunder rolled outside. She looked both older and younger than I remembered, old with disappointment, young with regret. As the hours passed, her story came out in fragments, not all at once, but in hesitant sentences, dropped like stones into the quiet. Her husband had left her for someone else. A co-worker, she said, though the word came out like a confession. There had been debts, unpaid bills, then eviction. Friends had faded. Family hadn't answered her calls. She'd driven for days with no plan, sleeping in her car by the highway, eating whatever she could afford from gas stations. When she said she remembered that I lived near the coast, I realized she had looked for me not out of nostalgia, but out of necessity. The thought stung more than I wanted to admit. Still, I listened. That was what I'd always done best. Listen without interrupting, absorb the pain others couldn't carry. When she finished, she looked up at me, her face pale and streaked with tears. "I'm sorry," she said, "for everything, for before." I wanted those words to comfort me, but they didn't. They were too light, too late, too easy. Apologies offered at the point of desperation are never real gifts. They're trades, a little shame in exchange for shelter. I didn't tell her that. I simply said, "You must be hungry." I took out what I had, bread, butter, soup from the night before, and placed it on the table. She ate quickly, like someone unaccustomed to kindness. I watched her, remembering the little girl who once refused to eat her vegetables until I promised to turn them into a story. I could still see her in the way she tilted her head, the small nervous laugh when she thanked me. For a moment, memory and reality overlapped, and I wasn't sure which of us was being forgiven. That night, she slept on the couch. I gave her blankets and a dry sweater. The rain had stopped by then, but the sound of water lingered in the pipes. I lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how forgiveness and self-betrayal can sometimes wear the same face. I told myself she was just passing through, that I was doing what anyone with a conscience would do. But beneath that reasonableness was something else, something more dangerous, the faint flickering hope that maybe this was how things healed, that love, once lost, might circle back like a bird returning to an abandoned nest. Days passed. She stayed. At first she spoke little. She helped around the apartment, sweeping, washing dishes, buying groceries with the little money she had left. I let her because refusing would have felt cruel, and because I didn't know what else to do. Gradually, we fell into a rhythm, a strange, tentative domesticity that wasn't quite family, but wasn't indifference either. Sometimes she'd talk about finding work, about saving for a place of her own, though I could hear the fear under her plans, the fear of being alone again, of being unseen. I knew that fear intimately. It was a language we shared without needing to name it. One evening, I found her sitting by the window, staring out at the rain. "You were right," she said suddenly, "about everything." I didn't ask what she meant. She went on, "When I told you not to come to the wedding, I thought it would make me look stronger, more refined. I didn't want people to think I came from someone ordinary. I was ashamed of the smallness I saw in you. The small house, the worn shoes, the way you told stories like they mattered." Her voice broke. and now I'd give anything to be that small again. I should have felt vindicated. I should have let that confession land where it deserved, sharp and clean, but all I felt was tired of being the mirror where others finally see their own ugliness. I told her that shame was a luxury she could no longer afford, that survival had no room for vanity. She nodded, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. Then she asked the question I had dreaded, "Can I stay?" I looked at her, at the hollowness around her eyes, the way she sat curled in on herself, the faint smell of exhaustion that clung to her. My first impulse was to say yes, because that is what love conditioned into obedience does. But then I remembered the long years of silence, the way my name had been erased from family photographs, the way she had built her happiness over my absence. So I said, "For a while, until you find your feet." She looked relieved, but I could feel the weight of the boundary between us settle like a door half closed. Living together was its own quiet test. Old habits resurfaced, her impatience my caution, the mutual politeness that sometimes cut sharper than cruelty. She apologized often, too often, until the word lost shape. I could see her trying to perform gratitude, as though behaving correctly could undo history. One morning, I caught her rearranging my cupboard, putting my things in new places to make it easier. The gesture infuriated me, not because it was unkind, but because it reminded me of how easily she had always rewritten spaces to suit herself. "Leave it," I said sharply. She froze, startled by the firmness in my tone. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "I was just trying to help." I turned away before she could see the tears in my eyes. I wasn't angry at her. I was angry at how easily love could still make me surrender ground I had fought to claim. Later that day, I walked to the shore alone. The wind was strong, sharp with salt. The sea roared like a warning. I thought about how forgiveness, at my age, isn't a single act but a daily labor, like breathing through pain. I picked up a stone and threw it into the water, watching it vanish beneath the waves. "That's for all the things I'll never say," I whispered. When I came back, Evelyn was asleep on the couch, curled like a child, her face soft in the lamplight. I stood there for a long time, watching her breathe. The ache in my chest was both love and mourning, inseparable, indistinguishable. Weeks went by. She found part-time work at a cafe, started saving money, talking about renting a room. We spoke more easily now, sometimes even laughed. But there were moments when the old distance flickered, in the way she checked her reflection before leaving the house, or how she hesitated before introducing me to a neighbor she'd met. Pride dies slowly, even in ruin. One evening she came home late, eyes red, voice trembling. "They said I looked too old to start over," she said. "Too late for everything." I wanted to tell her that I had lived that sentence for years, that being underestimated can be its own kind of freedom. Instead, I just held her hand. Her fingers were cold, thin, desperate. That night, after she'd gone to bed, I opened my notebook and wrote. She came back to the one place she thought was beneath her and found it still standing. So maybe I was never beneath her at all. It wasn't vengeance. It was balance. The next morning, I made pancakes, and she smiled like a child again. For a few hours, the years fell away. I didn't know if she would stay or if she would leave once comfort became familiar. But I knew this. Whatever came next, I would not vanish again. I had rebuilt myself too many times to become someone's refuge without also being my own. When she left for work that day, she kissed my cheek. It was a small thing, but it carried all the words we hadn't said. After she closed the door, I stood there in the quiet, surrounded by the faint smell of syrup and coffee. I realized then that the past doesn't dissolve. It lingers in the air like the scent of rain, fading slowly but never gone. And maybe that was enough. Not erasure, not reconciliation, but endurance. The story between us would never be simple, but it was alive again, and sometimes that's the only kind of healing we get. It happened in late autumn, the air sharp with the smell of burning leaves, the sea restless and gray. Evelyn had been living with me for nearly 6 months by then, long enough for her presence to settle into the rhythms of the apartment. Her hairbrush on the windowsill, her shoes by the door, her mug beside mine in the sink. We had grown accustomed to each other in a quiet, careful way, like two people who shared a secret too heavy to speak of. There were good days when she came home from work humming and told me about a kind customer or a funny coworker, and there were bad days when she shut herself in her room and I heard her crying softly through the thin wall. I never asked why. I had learned that sometimes questions only make wounds reopen. But that silence, the same silence that once protected me, had begun to feel like a thin layer of ice over deep water. I sensed something moving beneath it. Old pain, old pride, waiting to break through. One evening, after dinner, we sat in the small kitchen as the wind rattled the window pane. She was unusually restless, tapping her fingers on the table, her eyes darting to the clock as if time itself made her uneasy. Finally, she said, "I've been thinking about going back to the city." I felt a small, clean ache at those words, like the sting of salt on skin. "You should," I said after a pause. "You're too young to get stuck here." She nodded, looking relieved and guilty at the same time. "I found a small apartment," she added. "It's not much, but it's a start." I smiled, though I could feel something in my chest folding in on itself. Then it settled. She hesitated, then reached across the table and took my hand. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, "for everything." Her voice trembled slightly, and I realized she meant it. I squeezed her hand gently. "You don't have to thank me," I said. "Just do better this time." We cleaned up in silence. Later, I went to my room and sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker through the mist. I should have felt proud. She was leaving, moving forward, finding her own way. But instead, I felt a strange hollowness, the kind that comes when a chapter ends, not with resolution, but with an ellipsis. I knew she would leave, that she had always been meant to. I just hadn't expected the goodbye to taste so familiar, so much like all the others. Before bed, I slipped an envelope into her coat pocket. A small sum of money, nothing dramatic, just enough for her first rent payment. It was not generosity. It was closure, the kind I could afford to give. The next morning, I woke to the sound of the front door closing softly. She had left early, without a word. I found a note on the table. "I didn't want to wake you. I'll write soon. Love, Evelyn." The words were neat, careful, but something about them felt unfinished, as if she had written them in haste. I sat down and read the note again and again until the paper began to crease. The apartment was painfully quiet. Even the sea seemed still, holding its breath. I thought of all the times I had been left before, all the doors that had closed with that same gentle finality, and I realized that this was different. She hadn't left out of shame or pride this time. She had left because she could, and somehow that small difference made all the loneliness that followed bearable. Days passed, then weeks. No letter came, but I told myself she was busy. I kept her room tidy, watering the small plant she'd left by the window. I even caught myself setting out 2 cups in the morning before remembering there was only one of us again. Then, one evening, as I was closing the curtains, I saw her standing across the street. The light from the street lamp caught her face, pale and tense. She didn't wave. I went to the door, opened it, and she was already halfway to me. "I shouldn't have come," she said, before I could speak. Her voice was hoarse, her eyes red-rimmed. "He found me." For a moment, I didn't understand. "Your husband?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. She nodded. "He said I took something that wasn't mine. Money. I didn't. But he's threatened to ruin me. He says I owe him everything." She was shaking now, trembling with fear or exhaustion. I couldn't tell which. I led her inside, sat her down, poured her tea, though neither of us drank it. "You're safe here," I said. It was an instinct, not a promise, but she wasn't safe. The next day, a man came to the door. Tall, expensively dressed, his face slick with the confidence of someone used to being obeyed. He asked for Evelyn in that calm, cold voice that powerful men use when they believe the world is their possession. I told him she wasn't here. He smiled in a way that made my stomach turn. "Tell her she can't hide forever," he said, and walked away. I closed the door and locked it, my hands shaking. She emerged from her room, pale and silent. "He won't come back," I lied. She looked at me then with a mixture of terror and guilt. "He will," she whispered. "He always does." That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the dark, listening to her restless footsteps in the next room, the creak of the floorboards, the low sound of her crying. I thought of all the times I had stayed silent in my life. When my husband's temper had scared me, when my daughter had lied to protect him, when my granddaughter had erased me for her convenience. Silence had been my inheritance, and I had passed it down without meaning to, but something in me refused to continue the pattern. I got up, put on my coat, and stepped outside into the cold. The streets were empty, the air sharp. I walked to the nearest police station and stood at the counter until someone noticed me. When the officer asked how he could help, I said, "I'm here to make a report." My voice was calm, but I could feel the years of hesitation behind it trembling like glass about to break. I told them everything I knew, his name, his threats, the fear in her eyes. They listened, took notes, nodded politely, and told me they would look into it. I knew it was a small thing, but it was something. It was the first time in my life that I had spoken out not for survival, but for defiance. When I returned, the apartment was dark. I found her asleep on the couch, curled up with her coat still on. I covered her with a blanket and sat beside her until dawn. When she woke, I told her what I'd done. For a moment, she looked stunned. Then she began to cry, not softly this time, but with deep, shaking sobs that came from somewhere years below the surface. "No one's ever stood up for me before," she said. I wanted to tell her that no one had ever stood up for me either, that maybe this was our only chance to break the chain, but I said nothing. I simply took her hand and held it until her breathing slowed. The following week she left again, this time not in flight, but in search of something new. The police had arranged for her to stay in a shelter for women starting over. She promised to visit once she was settled. I didn't try to stop her. Before she left, she hugged me tightly, her tears wetting my cheek. "You saved me," she whispered. "No," I said. "I just didn't look away." She smiled through her tears. "That's the same thing." When she was gone, I stood in the doorway for a long time, the cold wind filling the empty space she left behind. But the silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't the silence of abandonment. It was the silence of peace earned through action. That night, I took out my notebook and wrote until my hand ached. I wrote about the years of invisibility, the weight of kindness mistaken for weakness, the way women like me are trained to endure until endurance becomes our only identity. I wrote about how it felt to finally act, to raise my voice, however small, and realize that it could still move something in the world. When I finished, I looked around the room, the lamp casting its warm light across the table, the half-empty cup of tea cooling beside me, and for the first time in a very long while, I felt alive, not as a memory or a caretaker or a placeholder for someone else's guilt, but as a woman who had chosen herself. Weeks later, a letter arrived. The envelope was smudged, the handwriting unfamiliar and shaky. Inside was a single page. Grandma, I found a job. It's not much, but I'm safe. I think about you every day. I love you. E. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my notebook. Then I went to the window, watching the sea stretch endlessly beneath the pale sky. I realized that I didn't need to hear from her again to know she was all right. The act of letting her go, this time with love instead of silence, was the real rescue for both of us. As dusk settled, I lit a candle and placed it on the windowsill. The flame flickered, reflecting against the glass. It looked fragile, almost ready to go out, yet it held steady. I thought of all the women I'd known, my mother, my daughter, myself, and how each of us had lived half our lives in the shadows of others' decisions. I whispered into the quiet, "It ends here." The words felt heavy and sacred, like a promise made to the generations that would never know my name but might feel my defiance in their bones. I sat there until the candle burned low, the wax pooling like melted time, and when I finally blew it out, I didn't feel loss. I felt release. Winter came quietly, almost tenderly, as if the world itself had grown weary of noise. The town was still, the sea iron gray, the air salted and cold enough to make every breath feel deliberate. I moved slower those days, not from pain, but from an awareness of how easily life could vanish between steps. The apartment seemed larger without Evelyn's presence. Her absence was not sharp anymore, not something to bleed over, but soft, a shape folded into the rhythm of my days. Her plant still stood by the window, stubbornly alive, and sometimes, when I watered it, I imagined she was in some other place doing the same thing, our gestures sinking across distance like an unspoken prayer. I had stopped waiting for letters, though one came every few months, written in that careful script of hers. They were full of small things, work, weather, new beginnings, and each ended with the same words. "I'm learning, Grandma. Thank you for not giving up on me." I would smile, place the letter in my notebook, and then go about my day. Love, I realized, does not need to be loud to survive. It only needs room. I kept working at the library, though less often now. Samuel, the librarian, worried about me walking in the cold, but I told him I needed the routine, the quiet presence of books, the way paper carried the scent of other lives. I liked the feeling of touching something that would outlast me. Sometimes, after closing, we would share tea and talk about trivial things, stray cats, storms, the price of bread. And yet beneath those simple words was a tenderness that required no declaration. I had grown suspicious of grand emotions. I preferred the small, durable ones that hid in gestures. He once said, "You remind me of those old novels that begin slowly and end without fuss, but stay with you anyway." I laughed and said, "That's the kind of ending I'd want." And I meant it. The nights were longer now, but I no longer feared them. I began to sleep with the curtains open, letting the moonlight spill across the floor. There was something comforting in the idea that light could visit uninvited and still be welcome. I would wake sometimes before dawn, make myself tea, and sit by the window watching the horizon brighten. The sea never looked the same twice. Some mornings it was calm as silk. Others it writhed and hissed like something alive. I found peace in its restlessness. It reminded me that even beauty could rage. On New Year's Eve, I walked to the pier alone. The town was quiet, the few remaining lights glowing like memories refusing to dim. I stood at the railing, the wind tugging at my scarf, and watched the waves break and retreat, their rhythm ancient and unbothered by human sorrows. I thought of Derek, of my daughter, of Evelyn, of the long chain of silences that had shaped us all. I thought of how every generation inherits a particular kind of pain and either repeats it or dissolves it. For most of my life, I had chosen endurance, mistaking it for strength. It had taken me 8 decades to understand that endurance without voice is merely slow disappearance. My granddaughter's return, her fear, her shame, had forced me to speak, not for her, but for myself. I had spent years believing that love was about forgiveness, about being the one who stays no matter what. Now I knew love could also be the act of setting a boundary and calling it mercy. The church bell rang midnight, and I closed my eyes. I remembered her as a little girl again, laughing as she ran through my garden, flower on her cheeks, petals in her hair, shouting, "Grandma, look at me." And I thought, yes, I see you now, truly see you, not as a wound or a betrayal, but as a woman, learning to be whole in her own way. The wind shifted, and the air smelled faintly of jasmine, though there were no flowers this time of year. Perhaps it was imagination, or perhaps some memories never fade. They only change form, like salt dissolving into water. I whispered, "Be free," and the waves answered with their endless applause. When I returned home, I lit a single candle and placed it beside the window. I sat in its glow and began to sort through my papers. I found the old wedding invitation again, the one I'd once kept as a symbol of rejection. I held it under the candlelight, the gold letters still faintly gleaming, and smiled. It no longer hurt to touch it. It had become just paper, finally stripped of its power. I folded it carefully, placed it inside an envelope with Evelyn's most recent letter, and tied them together with a piece of ribbon. Then I opened the window, and a gust of cold air swept in. The candle flickered, but didn't go out. I placed the bundle on the sill and let the wind carry it away. It lifted, hesitated, and then vanished into the dark. I whispered, "Go on now," and closed the window. The next morning, I woke to the sound of rain tapping gently on the glass. The sea was hidden behind mist, and the street below was empty. I made tea and sat by the window, watching the droplets trace paths down the pane. There was no sadness in me, only a deep, settled calm. I realized that for the first time in years, I had no one to forgive, not my granddaughter, not my daughter, not even myself. Forgiveness had quietly completed its work and stepped aside. In its place was something quieter but stronger, acceptance. Life had been what it was, imperfect and ungrateful, and yet, somehow, still beautiful. The betrayals had shaped me, yes, but they had not defined me. What defined me was the choice I made every day to keep opening the door to the sea, to memory, to possibility. By noon, the rain had stopped. Sunlight broke through, glinting off the wet rooftops. I opened the window again, breathing in the cool, clean air. Somewhere in the distance, a child laughed. It was such an ordinary sound, yet it filled the room completely. I closed my eyes and listened, and for a brief, exquisite moment, time itself seemed to hold its breath. I thought of every woman who had ever been told she was too much, too old, too embarrassing, too invisible, and I wanted to tell them, "You are none of those things. You are what remains when the noise fades. When the light began to soften, I stood and straightened the room, folded my shawl, and set the kettle to boil again. There was no epiphany, no grand finale, just the quiet pulse of life continuing. I poured my tea, added honey, and sat down. The plant by the window trembled slightly in the breeze, as if nodding. I reached out, touched one of its leaves, and smiled. "You're doing just fine," I said. Perhaps I was speaking to myself. The tea was warm, the air was kind, and the world, for all its cruelty, had not taken my tenderness. That, I thought, was victory enough. And so, this is how it ends. Not with sorrow, but with stillness. Not with a door closing, but with a window open to the sea. I am 82 years old, and I have lived long enough to know that the heart is not a ledger of who hurt you and who stayed. It is a garden, and even after the frost, something always finds a way to bloom again. I no longer wait for anyone to come home. I am home,